Welcome to the Oncologist Breast Cancer Curriculum Progress and Promise 2010. Today we're going to talk about understanding and treating triple-negative breast cancers, and I have with us Dr. Lisa Carey, a medical oncologist from UNC, and Dr. Chuck Peru, a basic and laboratory scientist at UNC, as part of the panel. Chuck, maybe we should start with you and tell us how in our day-to-day practice we ought to think about defining basal and triple-negative breast cancer based on the pathology data we have and perhaps the microarray data and how it all fits in.
Well, I think today the way we do it is to use the triple-negative as a means of identifying a group of patients that will require specific treatments, and I think that's very legitimate because of the predictive value for ER and PR and HER2, right? The patients who lack those three markers end up being in a treatment bin where they don't get endocrine therapy or trastuzumab. And so from that perspective, this is a group that we have to focus on and work on. From a biologic perspective, though, what we now appreciate is that this is predominantly a group made up of the basal-like tumors and a few of the other subtypes. And it looks like the basal-like tumors have a unique biology, and hopefully we can learn to target that biology. Some of the real pressing questions, I think, where the differences between the gene expression assays and the clinical assays lie, right? And that is that a quarter of the triple-negative tumors aren't basal, they're all the other groups, right? But also importantly is basically a quarter of the basal tumors are either ER positive or HER2 positive or PR positive. And, you know, in our retrospective look at numerous data sets, basal tumors that are ER positive tend to behave like basal tumors that are ER negative, right? And so maybe as we do additional retrospective and hopefully prospective studies, we can begin to see whether being basal can be a marker that might override a clinical ER assay or a clinical HER2 assay. We just don't know right now. But I think if the goal is to identify basal-like tumors, the best way to do it is the multi-gene assays, be it by microarray or qPCR that we've published on, and that those methods, I believe, are more accurate in identifying these groups than a couple of IHC markers pieced together.
Lisa, tell us your approach to treating patients with triple-negative breast cancer, for instance, in the adjuvant setting. How do you decide on chemotherapy? Do you have different algorithms you follow if they're node negative or node positive? And I won't let you sneak out of this by saying put them all on clinical trials, which I know you do anyway.
Well, I can say that you should put them all on clinical trials because it's obvious that there are a lot of very substantial questions that need to be answered about whether we should be using our chemotherapy different in different subtypes of breast cancer. And you know, our scientific colleagues, you know, have shown us data that suggests that there may be a difference in how the same, you know, drug affects different tumor types. That said, I won't. That's as wiggling as I'll do. I think if you are thinking simply conventional approaches, then in truth, we don't have any good data to support choosing different drugs for adjuvant therapy of triple-negative breast cancer than any other subtype if you're using chemotherapy. And I think we do have data suggesting that triple-negative breast cancers are sensitive to the drugs that we do use, particularly the anthracycline-based approaches and taxane-based approaches. And that typically is what I use. Now, I think many of us, we stratify our use of chemotherapy based on risk. And, you know, the truth is that the risk that you have to deal with the triple-negative breast cancer is by definition higher, and you're more dependent on the chemotherapy for the benefit simply because of the nature of the disease and the fact that you don't have the benefit of the adjuvant endocrine therapy and the HER2 targeting that you do in the other subtypes. So I think many of us, including me, are more likely to use third-generation regimens in a triple negative breast cancer that's a lower stage than we would in, say, a hormone receptor positive breast cancer. But the choice of the regimens themselves, I use the standard menu.
Right, so you wouldn't consider using a platinum compound outside of a defined regimen, perhaps like TCH, at this point?
Yeah, I typically don't. We do have, obviously, the availability of trials to ask this question, and I think off of a protocol. I mean, these are not benign drugs, and I think, I hope we learned from things like bone marrow transplant the problem with making assumptions without the actual prospective data to support it. So I tend to be a little bit of a strict constructionist about that.
Chuck, in your work, other than identifying the subtypes, you've defined and looked at some unique pathways that are potential targets for new drug development and new small molecules. Can you tell us a little bit about what you think are the more promising of these?
So again, focusing on the basal-like group, I think there's many promising drug targets. As Lisa showed in her presentation, activation of the HER1 pathway looks to be frequent and important, but the challenge there is effectively targeting it. It looks like in only a subset of the basal-like patients is activation of the pathway dependent on HER1 itself in a ligand-mediated manner. Most of the time it looks like there's other downstream events that turn on the pathway. So there are other drugs that target RAS or RAF or MEK or ERK, and so those are potential promising targets for basal-like tumors. But we'd probably have to know in that patient, is it at the receptor level or is it at the downstream level? And so that, of course, is going to require some companion diagnostics to go along with the new targeted agents. Certainly the BRCA1 story is very exciting, and work by ours and myself and other labs is showing that even though the BRCA1 gene itself might be apparently normal in most sporadic basal-like tumors or sporadic triple-negative tumors, there might be other components of that pathway that are defective. And if that's true, then the PARP inhibitors may be generally effective against all these basal-like tumors. I think the angiogenesis is also a good one. These tumors, as pathologists can tell you, are often have centers of necrosis and are hypoxic, and so can we effectively target that, I think, is also a promising avenue.
So Lisa, following up on Chuck's comments, are there any specific trials and targets and new drugs that you find most exciting that we should be pushing into more and more trials and trying to come to closure on where to go?
Well, I think the where to go story, I mean, the first order of business is to figure out the PARP inhibitor story. And I think that, there are multiple PARP inhibitors that may or may not act the same on the different PARPs. And getting a sense of what their role is with chemotherapy is the first thing, and fortunately will happen shortly. The second is, what is the optimal backbone to add these to? Do they have an effect as single agents? I think many of us think they probably require a chemotherapy stimulus. What's the best chemotherapy? And is there a way? I mean, I think the way forward for our patients certainly would like for us to figure out ways to minimize chemotherapy, as would we all. And is there a way of getting away from chemotherapy altogether, or using some of these targeted treatments to minimize the need for chemotherapy? I think Chuck was hitting on something that I think is really going to be our biggest challenge. In truth, even our best data, say the BSI 201 data, these patients went from a progression-free survival of 3 months, from dismal to better than dismal.
It's tough to tell a woman that you got great therapy that's going to improve her survival 5 months when she's 50.
Right. So, I mean, while, we get excited about the data because the Kaplan-Meier curves, splay, and that's wonderful, it's not a home run from this patient standpoint when you think in absolute terms. So how do we really make a big difference? So I think we're going to have to get back to the fact that the low-hanging fruit of targeted therapy may have been plucked with ER and HER2, and that we may need to be much more strategic about combining drugs. And in order to really shut down a pathway that's integral to the growth and proliferation of the tumor, we may need to know exactly what's turned on and what's turned off in that individual tumor, right? This is personalized medicine, which is what everybody wants, but it's not easy to get there, and it's heavily dependent on tissue-based studies being married to the clinical trials. Otherwise we operate in a black box. So I think that's going to be our biggest challenge moving forward.
So, hi, I have a question for you about personalized medicine. I find this molecular predictor of age quite fascinating. I wonder if you could tell us a little more about that. I mean, I think that could identify certain patients who, apparently are old but are young, and vice versa.
So it's very exciting, and Ned Sharpless here at UNC is really pioneering a lot of this work. But what's unique about this marker is it goes up logarithmically as we age. So unlike other molecular markers of aging, like interleukin-6 or measuring telomerase activity or the size of telomeres, there's tremendous differences one can see as we age. So I look at it as perhaps having two patients 70 who are both in pretty good shape in your clinic. One of those patients might have a 2 log higher P16 expression than the other patient. And perhaps that higher patient, we could predict accurately as we get more data that that's the patient more likely to have myelosuppression. Maybe that patient should be preemptively treated with growth factors. That patient might have other organ toxicity. Because what's interesting about the P16 is it's a gene that's epigenetically turned on in all tissues. So if you take these mice and they have very high P16 levels, their kidneys don't work as well as the mice with lower levels. So I think it's a terrific lead to integrate in with a lot of things. We already know things like radiation therapy in animal experiments increase your rate of P16. If you exercise or you stop smoking, you can't lower it, but you can change the rate of rise. Yeah. So you never can get out of
younger.
You can't get out of bad habits, but you can
slow aging.
You can kind of take it and make it them go a little bit slowly until they get you. But I think it's very exciting, and we're hoping to integrate this in group activities and with a lot of other collaborators and add it on, to really some of the outstanding collaborative science that we have in trials. And maybe that follows back to you. I think what's crucial today is the team effort of working together in translational research and the collaborative efforts and neoadjuvant trials where we can get tissue. And I wonder if you have any thoughts or comments how we could make this more generalizable and how important it is.
Only second that thought, right? I mean, it's just critical to have basic scientists, oncologists, pathologists, bring in population-based people to address all these questions. But certainly we need all the disciplines working together to get the right tissue, get the right annotation, run the right molecular assays to find the correlative biomarkers. And if any one piece is missing, then the whole process falls down, I think. And so we really need to foster as much of this as we can, and I think most of the cooperative groups are now doing this.
But I think, let me just ask you, I want to follow up something that you were mentioning. So one of the things that I think happens, we're all in the clinic and we see a woman who's 72 and you say, oh God, please let her tumor be ER positive. Yeah. But in truth, we do see a substantial number of women, and people will say, oh, she's an older woman with a young woman's tumor with these high-grade triple-negative breast cancers. And I know there is there's certainly a sense from the overview and things that chemotherapy effectiveness was thought to be less as women got older. And I think you have some data that really suggests that the conventional wisdom may in fact not be right. And I'd love it if you'd comment a little bit about sort of the triple negative phenotype in an older patient and what the optimal treatment might be.
Yeah, I think that some of the new data from the overview suggests what they call ER poor tumors, which are probably dominated by triple negative patients. that, at least from the 50 to 69, it's a shame in the overview there are so few people above 70, in spite of the thousands of patients in the analysis, but they seem to derive great benefit. And I suspect from looking at data that others have looked at that probably age is not, and I don't think we still know why in premenopause, like in patients who are hormone receptor positive, why we get more benefit from chemotherapy in younger women than older. Mm-hmm. And we talk about effects on menses and the effects of chemotherapy causing ovarians, but I don't think we really know. But I think age is not a factor in the triple-negative breast cancer, that the subtype really dominates all the other issues perhaps, and that the chemotherapy is likely to be equally effective in older people. So I think if you have older patients, they should be treated in the state-of-the-art therapy. They should be on our clinical trials. They should get the best agents. They should get perhaps the anthracyclines and taxanes, because I don't think, for whatever reasons, age is important there.
Well, I think you actually have some data from CLGB 49907 about using, better drugs versus less effective drugs in this population.
So if nothing else, that unless you're cynical and think that capecitabine negatively affected the patients, that chemotherapy certainly made a difference, and it dominated there. And that's older type, that's CMF and AC. And I think from data that we've looked at in CLGB, like Don Berry's analysis, looking in JAMA at all the iterations of chemotherapy, that as we've added the taxanes onto AC and had more aggressive therapy, that we've had much better proportional reductions in risk of relapse and much better outcomes by adding it to that triple-negative group. So question back to you, sometimes we're asked about the triple-negative patient who comes in and we look at the path report and there's a metaplastic cancer and we press and our pathologists are very confident it's a breast cancer, or it's one of the more unusual subtypes of breast cancer, a medullary cancer that's a triple-negative. What are your thoughts and how do you manage those patients?
Well, metaplastic is really a very intriguing, special histology because it really, it doesn't look like breast cancer and it doesn't necessarily act like one. Although, some of them are in fact sensitive to the drugs we give and some are not. And I think it's been a real puzzle. In part, it's a puzzle because they're so rare. It's very hard to study them. If you try, you have to get, lots of different groups together to pool their data to try and say anything. But I think people are getting a better handle on it. I mean, Chuck, can you comment? You actually have some information about, the biology. Chuck's done some studies on this particular histology.
We had a collaborative study with colleagues at the MD Anderson, and we looked at the metaplastics, and what we could see from the molecular level was that they had great similarities to the Claudin low subtype and the basal-like group, and they almost looked like, most of them looked like they were hybrid between them. And so they're enriched for the stem cell features. Actually, they were enriched for the Jenny Chang tumor initiating cell signature as well. And so they're kind of now in this similar boat, but also have some unique characteristics. And so we should, stem cell targeted therapies might be relevant for them, and the chemotherapy. Some of them are sensitive. Well, there's probably a benefit there, but I think we need to understand more about their basic biology and be more precise in the targeting as well.
The medullaries are a little different because the medullaries are, they're enriched in the BRCA1 associated tumors, which typically are basal-like, and so I'm not sure we have a sense that behaviorally they're necessarily going to be different than the other sporadic basal-likes.
One of the problems we're all plagued by is seeing these patients who may be a little older and they have very tiny tumors. They have 4-millimeter triple-negative cancer. Yeah. And a lot of them do well. But, are there any clues or anything in the arrays that we might separate out the people who really are likely to spread from those that not within this subgroup?
Within triple-negatives, in our hands, prognosis has been quite difficult to tease out. And overall, they have a poor prognosis in the absence of therapy, and some people have teased out what might be a few better actors in that group, but it's not, they're not so much better that you would not make a decision to give an aggressive treatment, in my opinion, right? And so there might be some good players in there, but not so much better that you would just go, oh well, all you have to do is surgery and radiation and stop there. And so I think.
Well, I'm going to challenge you on that a little bit. I mean, seriously, stage is still important, right?
Oh,
we don't treat. The thing that always strikes me, this pendulum swinging, right? So for years we were all about how big is it, are the nodes involved or not, and then we have God bless you, all this great biology, right? And now it's all about biology, but in truth, every one of these studies that look at different profiles, the intrinsic subtypes, the prognostic profiles, they all find that these profiles are independent of clinical factors, which is of course the added value of the profile. But the flip side of that is the clinical factors are independent of the profile too, and they're still important. Right. And the thing, everything you're saying is very correct.
Size and node status is definitely independent of most of these sides. Things like grade are correlated,
right.
But stage, I mean, we've done many multivariable tests, and stage always stays.
Yeah, right. Always. It always stays in. And the thing I always say to people say, well, I have a micro-invasive DCIS and it looks triple negative.
Right.
Whoa, I mean, there's no biology in a micro-invasive DCIS that will turn this into a high-risk tumor. It doesn't exist. So, so it's still important. Although I think Chuck's point is, as you get these poor prognosis biologic subtypes within each stage, they have very clear prognostic impacts. But I think we have to also be sensible about this. I personally have not seen a rash of relapses in microinvasive DCIS that's triple negative.
Right. And I think it was underscored by some of the data even from the Oncotype, obviously not triple negative patients, but showing that although the recurrence score is very helpful, a low score means a low risk. When you start adding people with 4 or more nodes, there's a tremendous difference in the meaning of a low recurrence score, and a lot of patients would not perceive a 30% 10-year risk of cancer spread on endocrine therapy as low. So I think your points are well taken. Well, this has been a great discussion. Lisa, thank you so much, and Chuck, thank you, and hope you enjoy the specific talks on these topics. And thanks for being with us today. We hope, we certainly have had a good time and learned from each other, and we hope you've learned from us. Thank you.